The smallest whisper can collapse an entire world when no one chooses to hear it. The morning light over Ash Hollow Pack spread across the wide ceremonial grounds like polished gold, touching the stone pathways, tall pine borders, and rows of wooden seating arranged for the seasonal gathering that marked the transition into the colder months. Everything looked peaceful on the surface, as if the pack had gathered only for celebration, tradition, and unity. Yet beneath that surface there was always an unspoken expectation that everyone should appear strong, composed, and unbothered by anything that could not be easily explained. Olivia Harper stood near the edge of the gathering space, her hands folded gently in front of her pale blue dress, her blonde hair falling loosely over her shoulders as she tried to match the calm expressions of those around her. At 22 years old, she had learned how to survive in silence more than she had learned how to ask for help. Every breath she took felt measured, not because she was anxious about being seen, but because she was carefully managing something no one else could see. The benches arranged for the ceremony were already filling with omegas, betas, and elders, all settling into their places with casual ease, laughing softly, exchanging greetings, adjusting their seating without hesitation. Olivia took a small step toward an empty seat, then stopped. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her dress as she forced a gentle smile, pretending she was simply waiting for someone rather than avoiding something she could not fully describe aloud. A passing Omega noticed her standing still and offered a polite glance. "You are not sitting?" she asked casually, already turning away before waiting for a full answer. Olivia nodded faintly, her voice barely audible. "I will sit in a moment." The words were simple, harmless, and yet they carried more weight inside her than anyone could understand. She had been repeating versions of that sentence for days, each time hoping the next attempt would feel easier, each time discovering it did not. Around her, the pack continued to settle into the ceremony space. The sound of wood benches shifting, soft fabric brushing against stone, and distant conversation created a rhythm that should have felt comforting, but instead made her feel increasingly separated from everyone else. She tried once more to lower herself onto a seat, moving slowly, carefully, as if precision could somehow reduce discomfort. Halfway down, she paused. Her breath caught quietly, her posture stiffening just enough that she instinctively rose again before anyone could notice. She turned her movement into a subtle adjustment of her dress, hoping it would appear natural. No one looked at her long enough to question it. That was both a relief and a quiet ache she could not explain. Across the ceremonial grounds, the atmosphere shifted slightly as the arrival of higher authority was announced. Conversations softened, heads turned, and attention drifted toward the main pathway leading into the gathering space. Olivia followed the movement of others without fully understanding why her heartbeat changed its rhythm. She did not seek attention. In fact, she had spent most of her life avoiding it. Yet something about the sudden quiet made her feel more exposed than before. The pack believed in strength that could be seen, in confidence that could be proven, in struggles that could be explained clearly within a single sentence. What Olivia carried did not fit any of those expectations. She adjusted her stance again, shifting her weight to relieve pressure she could not describe, unaware that in the distance, someone was already watching her with a level of focus that did not belong to curiosity alone, but to something far more precise and unsettling for those who had grown used to being observed only when they chose to be seen. The ceremonial grounds slowly filled as the morning light grew warmer, casting long shadows across the stone pathways and polished wooden benches, while the soft hum of conversation returned like a gentle tide that covered every corner of Ash Hollow Pack. Olivia Harper remained standing near the edge of the seating area, her posture carefully controlled, her expression calm in a way that required constant effort rather than natural ease. She watched others settle into place without hesitation, some laughing quietly, others adjusting their clothing or greeting neighbors with familiar comfort, and each small gesture reminded her of how effortless belonging seemed for everyone except her. She took another step toward the empty bench she had been considering earlier, then stopped again, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric of her dress as she shifted her weight with practiced subtlety. The sensation she had been managing for days had not changed, but her ability to ignore it had slowly become more difficult with every passing hour. Still, she refused to draw attention to herself. In a pack where silence often meant strength, she had learned to make her discomfort invisible even to those standing only a few feet away. A nearby Omega glanced at her briefly, offering a polite smile that did not linger long enough to invite conversation. "You are still standing," the woman said casually before turning away to join her friends. Olivia responded with a small nod that barely qualified as acknowledgement. "Yes, I am fine," she said softly, although the words felt more like habit than truth. Around her, the atmosphere shifted again as a subtle wave of awareness spread through the gathering space. The arrival of the Alpha King had been announced, and although he had not yet entered the main ceremonial area, his presence was already altering the behavior of those waiting. Conversations lowered, movements became more composed, and attention gradually redirected toward the main pathway leading into the grounds. Olivia followed the shift without meaning to, her eyes drawn toward the same direction as everyone else, even though she had no personal expectation of being seen by anyone important. She had never interacted with the Alpha King, never spoken his name beyond formal references, and never imagined her life would intersect with his in any meaningful way. Yet something about the change in atmosphere made her more aware of herself than she had been moments before. She adjusted her stance again, attempting to ease the quiet discomfort that had become harder to ignore, unaware that her subtle movements were already being observed from a distance with unusual precision. Ethan Blackwood had arrived without announcement beyond the necessary formalities, his presence marked not by noise, but by the immediate stillness it created in those who recognized authority without needing it explained. He stood at the edge of the ceremonial path for a moment, scanning the gathering with calm gray eyes that missed nothing yet revealed very little. Advisors and elders moved slightly to accommodate his path forward, but he did not hurry. Instead, his attention drifted across the seated crowd with quiet discipline until it settled on a single figure standing apart from the rest. Olivia Harper did not notice him yet. She was focused on maintaining composure, on ensuring that no one would interpret her silence as anything unusual. But Ethan noticed the details others overlooked. The way she avoided lowering herself onto the bench despite appearing ready to do so. The way she shifted her weight with careful restraint. The way her smile never fully relaxed, even when no one was speaking to her directly. These were not the behaviors of someone simply choosing to stand. They were the patterns of someone managing something persistent and unspoken. He took a slow step forward, not interrupting the ceremony, not drawing attention unnecessarily, but moving with a quiet intent that subtly redirected the attention of those closest to him. The crowd reacted instinctively, parting just enough to allow his passage while trying not to appear as though they were reacting at all. Olivia finally felt the shift before she understood its cause. A change in the air around her, a quiet stillness that seemed to form a narrow space where sound softened and movement slowed. She lifted her gaze slightly, only then beginning to realize that someone was approaching her position with deliberate focus rather than casual curiosity. And for the first time that morning, she felt the uncomfortable possibility that she was about to be seen more clearly than she had intended. Olivia Harper felt the shift in the atmosphere before she fully understood its meaning. The quiet pressure of attention that had been forming across the ceremonial grounds seemed to tighten into a single direction, as though every sound and movement in Ash Hollow Pack had unconsciously aligned toward the same point. She hesitated, her fingers lightly brushing against the fabric of her pale blue dress as she tried to maintain the appearance of calm she had practiced for years. The discomfort she had been managing since morning had not changed, yet something about the moment made it harder to ignore. Ethan Blackwood continued forward at an unhurried pace, each step measured with quiet authority that did not demand space, but naturally created it. The crowd parted without protest, elders and warriors alike lowering their voices as he passed, though none of them could explain why the air itself felt different when he moved through it. Olivia finally lifted her gaze. She saw him clearly for the first time at a closer distance, tall and composed, his expression unreadable yet not unkind, gray eyes focused not on the ceremony, not on the crowd, but directly on her. A subtle breath caught in her chest as she realized he was walking toward her position with intent rather than coincidence. Around her, whispers began to form in low tones, confused and uncertain. Is he coming here? Someone murmured. Why would the Alpha King approach an Omega standing at the edge? Another voice asked. Olivia instinctively shifted her weight again, a small movement she had repeated throughout the morning without realizing how noticeable it had become to someone watching closely. Ethan stopped only a few steps away from her, close enough that the surrounding sound of the ceremony seemed to fade into a distant background. He did not immediately speak. Instead, he observed her with calm attention, his gaze steady but not intrusive, as though he was gathering information rather than making assumptions. Olivia lowered her eyes slightly, uncertain of what was expected from her in a moment like this. She had never been addressed directly by someone of his rank in such an informal setting, and the silence between them felt heavier than any conversation she had experienced that morning. Finally, Ethan spoke in a voice that carried neither command nor judgment. Why are you still standing? The question was simple, almost ordinary, yet it caused a ripple of stillness among those nearby who had begun to realize they were witnessing something unusual. Olivia hesitated. She had been asked variations of this question before, but never with this level of attention behind it. Every previous assumption she had encountered had already been formed before she could answer. This time felt different, as though the question itself was waiting for truth rather than confirmation. I am fine, she replied automatically at first, the phrase escaping before she could reconsider it. But something in Ethan's expression did not change or accept the answer as complete. He did not interrupt. He simply waited. That quiet patience unsettled her more than skepticism ever had. After a brief pause, she added in a softer voice, "It is just easier to stand right now." A few nearby members of the pack exchanged glances, unsure how to interpret the response. Some appeared mildly amused, others confused, as though they were waiting for a clearer explanation that never arrived. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her, not on the reactions of the crowd. "Easier," he repeated calmly, as though testing the word rather than questioning it. Olivia nodded faintly, still avoiding direct eye contact. The silence that followed was no longer casual. It carried weight, the kind that made those nearby unconsciously stop shifting and settle into stillness. Ethan finally spoke again, his tone unchanged. "Have you tried to sit since arriving here?" The question was not delivered as doubt, but as careful inquiry. Olivia hesitated longer this time. She had tried, more than once, but every attempt had ended the same way, quietly and without explanation. "Yes," she admitted softly. A faint tightening appeared in Ethan's expression, not of anger, but of understanding forming where there had previously been uncertainty. The surrounding crowd reacted immediately. A few dismissive comments surfaced, suggesting she was exaggerating or misunderstanding her own condition, but none of them reached the space between Olivia and the Alpha King. He remained focused entirely on her, as if the rest of the world had temporarily lost relevance. "And it was difficult," he said, not as a question this time, but as a recognition. Olivia finally looked up at him, her voice almost breaking through years of restraint. "Yes," she said again, quieter than before, but more honest than anything she had spoken that morning. In that moment, the distance between them did not feel defined by rank or expectation. It felt defined only by whether someone was willing to listen long enough for truth to become visible. The silence that followed Olivia Harper's confirmation did not break immediately. Instead, it deepened, as if the entire ceremonial ground had collectively paused to understand what her answer truly meant. Ethan Blackwood remained still, his gaze steady on her face, not pressing further, not withdrawing, simply observing with a level of focus that made Olivia feel both exposed and strangely protected at the same time. Around them, the pack began to react in uneven waves. Some members exchanged doubtful glances, others leaned toward one another in quiet conversation, and a few simply watched in confusion, uncertain why a simple exchange had drawn so much attention from the Alpha King himself. Olivia instinctively lowered her gaze again, her hands tightening gently against the fabric of her dress as she tried to regain control over the moment. She had not expected to become the center of attention. She never wanted it. All she had wanted was to stand quietly until the discomfort passed or until she could leave without being noticed. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice calm but firmer in presence than before. "How long has this been happening?" The question was not delivered with doubt, but with intent, as though he was mapping out something unseen rather than interrogating her. Olivia hesitated. Time had become difficult to measure. Days had blended into one another, each one marked by the same effort to appear normal while quietly adjusting every movement of her body. "Several days," she answered softly. A faint shift moved through the nearby listeners. It was subtle, but noticeable enough to indicate that the answer was not what many had expected. Some had assumed she was exaggerating a single moment. Others had believed it was simply discomfort from standing too long. Ethan's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his focus sharpened. "And you continued attending ceremonies during that time," he said, not as an accusation, but as a confirmation of fact. Olivia nodded faintly. "I did not think it was important enough to stop attending." A brief silence followed her words. That sentence carried more weight than she realized. It revealed not only what she had been experiencing, but how little importance she believed her own discomfort deserved compared to the expectations around her. A few elders nearby exchanged uneasy looks. One of them quietly murmured that perhaps she should have spoken sooner, while another suggested that young Omegas often misunderstood their own limits. None of these comments reached Olivia directly, but she could feel their presence in the air around her, familiar and discouraging in a way she had grown used to over time. Ethan took a slow step closer, reducing the distance between them just enough that his voice no longer carried beyond the immediate space. "You believed it was not important," he repeated, not as judgment, but as reflection. Olivia nodded again, her voice barely steady. "There are many others who have real responsibilities. I did not want to interrupt anything for something I could manage." For the first time since he had arrived, Ethan looked away from her briefly, scanning the surrounding pack. His expression remained controlled, but the silence he carried with him shifted the mood around them. Conversations faded again without instruction. Attention returned fully to the center where he stood. "What you are describing is not a matter of importance," he said quietly. "It is a matter of being heard." Olivia felt her throat tighten slightly at the words. They were simple, but they reached a place she had not expected anyone to acknowledge. Before she could respond, Ethan turned slightly, addressing not just her, but those within hearing distance. When someone says something is wrong, the first response is not interpretation. It is attention. The surrounding pack grew still again. Olivia remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the ground for a brief moment before she slowly lifted them back toward him. For the first time that morning, she did not feel as though she needed to explain herself quickly in order to avoid inconvenience. Instead, she felt as though someone had finally decided that her words were worth hearing fully before being measured against assumption. Ethan returned his focus to her. "You do not need to convince anyone here," he said calmly. "You only need to be honest." In that moment, Olivia did not yet realize that her quiet struggle had already begun to shift something far larger than her own experience. The air around the ceremonial grounds seemed to shift once more, not through any sudden movement, but through the quiet realization spreading among those who were listening closely. Olivia Harper stood in place as Ethan Blackwood's words settled into the space between them, creating a stillness that felt different from the earlier silences. This one carried weight, not of judgment, but of attention that refused to fade. She did not speak immediately. For so long, she had become accustomed to filling silence quickly, to softening her own experiences so they would not take up too much space in conversations that never seemed prepared to hold them. Now, however, she found herself unable to rush her response. Ethan remained steady, his posture unchanged, his attention still fully directed toward her. Around them, the pack members continued to observe, though the energy had shifted from casual curiosity to something more uncertain, as if they were realizing that the moment was no longer about interpretation but about understanding. Olivia finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, but more grounded. "I thought if I made it through each day without drawing attention, it would eventually stop mattering." The words were simple, but they carried the accumulation of days spent enduring without acknowledgement. A few people nearby exchanged subtle glances, their expressions softening slightly, though still uncertain how to respond. Ethan did not interrupt. He allowed her words to remain complete before responding, as if respecting the shape of her experience rather than trying to reshape it. "You learned to minimize yourself," he said calmly, "because the environment around you made that feel necessary." Olivia hesitated, then gave a faint nod. She had never considered it in those exact terms, but something about it felt undeniably accurate. I did not want to inconvenience anyone, she said after a moment. Ethan's gaze remained steady. Inconvenience is not the same as neglect, he replied. The distinction settled quietly in the air. Olivia looked down again, her fingers loosening slightly at her sides as though she was no longer holding herself together with the same tension as before. The surrounding pack remained silent, though not in the same dismissive way as earlier. There was a growing sense that something important was being acknowledged in real time, something that had been overlooked long before this moment. A distant voice attempted to lighten the atmosphere, suggesting that perhaps she was simply sensitive or needed rest, but it faded quickly as Ethan's presence continued to hold the center of attention without effort. He turned slightly toward the gathering once more. There is a difference between what is visible and what is real, he said evenly. Assuming one replaces the other is where understanding fails. Olivia listened, her breathing slower now, though still careful. She had spent so long preparing for dismissal that she did not know how to fully process acceptance when it arrived without conditions. Ethan then returned his focus to her directly. You did not fail to explain, he said. You were not given space where explanation mattered. That sentence lingered longer than any before it. Olivia felt something shift quietly inside her, not as sudden relief, but as a slow release of something she had carried without naming for too long. She had always believed that if others did not understand her, it was because she had not spoken clearly enough. Hearing it framed differently unsettled that belief in a way she did not yet have words for. Around them, the ceremonial environment continued in the background, but it no longer defined the moment. Ethan's attention remained steady, not demanding more from her, not rushing her toward resolution, but holding space for her words to exist without being reduced. Olivia finally lifted her gaze slightly. What happens now? She asked quietly. It was not a question of fear, but of uncertainty shaped by unfamiliar possibility. Ethan's response was calm and certain. Now, he said, we make sure you are no longer unheard when it matters most. In that moment, Olivia did not yet realize that the foundation of everything she had been taught about silence and endurance had already begun to change. Ethan Blackwood remained still for a brief moment after speaking, allowing his words to settle without interruption. The space around him felt unusually quiet, not because the ceremony had stopped, but because attention had narrowed into something more focused than before. Olivia Harper stood facing him, her expression uncertain yet more open than it had been earlier. The question she had asked still lingered in the air, and his answer had introduced a possibility she was not used to considering. Around them, members of Ash Hollow Pack continued to observe with restrained curiosity. Some remained skeptical, while others appeared unsettled by how quickly the tone of the moment had shifted away from assumption and toward acknowledgement. Ethan finally turned slightly, not breaking the connection with Olivia, but expanding his awareness to include those gathered nearby. This is not a matter that ends with interpretation, he said calmly. It requires understanding before conclusion. Olivia shifted her stance again, more slowly this time, as if becoming aware that even her smallest movements were now being noticed differently than before. The discomfort she had carried earlier still remained, but the urgency to hide it had begun to weaken under the weight of being taken seriously. A council elder stepped forward cautiously. Your Majesty, he said with measured respect, if there is concern for her condition, perhaps it would be best to allow the healers to evaluate her after the ceremony is complete. We should not disrupt tradition without necessity. Ethan looked toward the elder without changing his calm expression. Tradition does not lose meaning when we pause to recognize reality, he replied evenly. The elder hesitated, then stepped back slightly, uncertain how to respond without challenging authority. Olivia listened quietly, her attention divided between the discussion unfolding around her and the fact that, for the first time, she was not being spoken about as a problem to be minimized. Ethan returned his focus to her. Have you attempted to explain this to anyone before today? He asked. The question was not accusatory, but reflective. Olivia hesitated. I tried, she said softly, but it never seemed like something worth explaining in detail. People usually assumed it was temporary. A faint pause followed her words. Ethan nodded once, as though confirming something he had already begun to understand. When assumptions replace listening, he said, even clear experiences become invisible. The surrounding pack remained quiet, though the earlier skepticism had begun to fade into a more reflective silence. Olivia looked down briefly, then spoke again, her voice more steady than before. I stopped trying to explain because I did not want to be dismissed again. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the weight of her statement to remain unbroken, giving it space to exist without being reduced. Then he spoke again, quietly but firmly. You should never have needed to stop explaining in order to be respected. Those words reached deeper than any earlier response. Olivia felt a subtle tightening in her chest, not from discomfort, but from recognition. She had spent so long adjusting herself to avoid rejection that she had never considered what it meant to exist without that expectation. Around them, several pack members exchanged glances that carried less certainty than before. The confidence of earlier judgments had begun to erode under the steady presence of unanswered truth. Ethan finally took a small step closer, reducing the distance between them without invading her space. You will not be expected to carry this alone moving forward, he said. Olivia looked up at him again, uncertainty still present in her expression, but now joined by something quieter and unfamiliar. I do not know what that means, she admitted. Ethan's response was simple. It means you will be heard before conclusions are made. The moment settled between them without urgency. Olivia did not yet fully understand what was changing, but she could feel that something fundamental had already shifted, not only in how others saw her, but in how she was beginning to see herself. The atmosphere across Ash Hollow Pack continued to shift in subtle but undeniable ways as Ethan Blackwood's presence held the attention of everyone gathered, not through force, but through the quiet certainty that something important was being addressed beyond ceremonial tradition. Olivia Harper remained standing where she had been for most of the morning, though her posture had begun to change in ways she did not fully notice yet. The effort to appear unaffected had not disappeared, but it no longer felt like the only option available to her. Ethan stood beside her at a measured distance, his attention still steady, as if ensuring that the space around her remained stable rather than overwhelming. The surrounding pack members had not dispersed, but their reactions had softened into uncertainty rather than judgment. Conversations were now rare and subdued, replaced by quiet observation and a growing awareness that their earlier assumptions had been incomplete. A council member cautiously spoke again, addressing Ethan with careful respect. Your Majesty, if this is a matter of concern, perhaps it would be more appropriate to continue privately. The ceremony has already been disrupted longer than expected. Ethan turned slightly toward the speaker, his expression unchanged but his tone firm enough to settle further discussion. What you call disruption is what happens when something important is finally being acknowledged, he replied. The council member lowered his gaze, no longer attempting to respond. Olivia listened to the exchange without speaking, her focus shifting between the voices around her and the realization that no one was dismissing her experience outright anymore. That change alone felt unfamiliar enough to make her uncertain how to respond. She had grown used to preparing herself for disbelief. Now, she was being met with something closer to consideration, and it left her without the defenses she normally relied on. Ethan turned his attention back to her. You do not need to continue standing to prove anything, he said calmly. Olivia hesitated. I am used to it now, she admitted quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a history of repeated endurance that had gradually become routine rather than exception. Ethan studied her for a brief moment before responding. Being used to something does not mean it is acceptable, he said. The statement lingered in the air, not as correction, but as reframing. Olivia looked down briefly, absorbing the idea without immediately rejecting it. Around them, members of the pack remained still, their attention divided between the ceremony and the conversation unfolding at its center. Some appeared increasingly uncomfortable, not because of conflict, but because their previous certainty no longer felt stable. Ethan then spoke again, slightly shifting his stance so that his voice could be heard clearly by those nearest. This pack has always valued strength, he said. But strength without awareness becomes assumption. And assumption, when left unchallenged, replaces truth with convenience. The words were not accusatory, yet they carried enough weight that several elders exchanged quiet, reflective glances. Olivia remained silent, but her expression had changed. There was less tension in her posture, though the discomfort she had been managing had not disappeared. What had changed was the expectation that she must hide it completely in order to remain present. Ethan returned his focus to her. "You were not meant to navigate this alone," he said more softly. Olivia finally met his gaze fully, uncertainty still present, but no longer overwhelming. "I do not know what changes from here," she said honestly. Ethan's response was steady. "What changes is that your experience will no longer be dismissed before it is understood." The surrounding silence deepened once more, but it no longer felt like judgment. It felt like reflection. Olivia stood in that moment, realizing that for the first time since she could remember, she was not being asked to minimize herself in order to remain part of the space she occupied. The ceremonial grounds of Ash Hollow Pack remained still, yet the silence that now filled the space was no longer shaped by confusion or skepticism alone. It had shifted into something more reflective, as if every person present was quietly re-examining what they believed they had understood only moments earlier. Olivia Harper stood in the same position she had occupied for much of the morning, but something subtle had changed in the way she carried herself. The constant pressure to hide her condition behind composure had not disappeared entirely, yet it no longer felt like the only way she could exist within the space around her. Ethan Blackwood remained beside her, his presence steady and composed, his attention no longer focused on questioning, but on ensuring that what had already been acknowledged was not dismissed again. Around them, the pack members stood in varied states of uncertainty. Some avoided eye contact, others watched with quiet discomfort, and a few remained frozen in place, still processing the shift that had occurred when assumptions were replaced with observation. A council elder stepped forward once more, though this time his voice carried less certainty. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if this matter requires continued attention, perhaps it should be handled away from the ceremony. The gathering is meant for unity, not prolonged discussion." Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression unchanged, but his tone calm and deliberate. "Unity is not maintained by ignoring what requires understanding," he replied. The elder hesitated, then slowly stepped back, no longer pressing the matter. Olivia listened to every exchange, her attention divided between the external conversation and the internal realization that she was no longer being treated as an inconvenience to be minimized. The shift was not loud or dramatic, but it was undeniable. For the first time, her experience was not being filtered through assumptions before being considered. Ethan redirected his attention toward her. "You have spent enough time adapting to discomfort without acknowledgement," he said evenly. Olivia hesitated before responding, her voice quieter than before, but more stable. "I did not know there was another way," she admitted. The honesty in her words settled between them without resistance. It was not an excuse, nor a defense, but a simple reflection of what her experience had taught her until now. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the truth without judgment. "There is always another way when people are willing to listen before deciding," he said. The surrounding pack remained silent, though their silence had changed in quality. It was no longer filled with dismissal or quiet amusement. Instead, it carried the weight of reconsideration, as though many were beginning to understand how easily certainty could form without sufficient understanding. Olivia shifted her stance slightly again, but this time there was less urgency in the movement. The need to constantly conceal her condition had begun to loosen, replaced by a cautious awareness that she was not being evaluated solely through expectation anymore. Ethan observed this without comment, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. After a brief pause, he spoke again, this time addressing not only her, but those within hearing range. "When someone speaks about their experience, the responsibility of those listening is not to decide quickly," he said. "It is to ensure they have truly been heard." A faint ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but noticeable. Some lowered their gaze, others shifted uncomfortably, and a few remained still, absorbing the implication of what had just been stated. Olivia looked down for a moment, then slowly lifted her gaze again. "I always thought I had to explain myself perfectly for it to matter," she said quietly. Ethan responded without hesitation. "You were never meant to prove your experience to deserve acknowledgement," he said. The words settled deeply, not as comfort alone, but as correction to a long-held misunderstanding. Olivia stood in silence, no longer rushing to adjust herself or hide the discomfort she had been managing throughout the morning. For the first time, she was not measuring her presence against the expectations of others. Instead, she was beginning to understand that being heard did not require her to disappear first. The ceremonial grounds of Ash Hollow Pack remained quiet, but the silence had evolved into something far more complex than hesitation or confusion. It now carried reflection, as if every person present was quietly reconsidering the assumptions they had formed only moments earlier. Olivia Harper stood in the same place she had occupied for most of the morning, yet her awareness of herself within the space had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. The constant need to hide her discomfort behind controlled composure was still present, but it no longer felt like the only reality available to her. Ethan Blackwood remained beside her, steady and composed, his attention no longer focused on investigation, but on ensuring that the understanding already reached would not be dismissed or diluted. Around them, the pack members continued to stand in uneven silence. Some avoided looking directly at Olivia, others watched with quiet uncertainty, and a few appeared visibly unsettled by how quickly certainty had dissolved into reconsideration. A council elder finally spoke again, his tone more cautious than before. "Your Majesty," he said, "while we acknowledge your concern, it may still be more appropriate to conclude the ceremony before addressing individual matters. The pack has gathered for unity." Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression unchanged but his presence firm. "Unity that depends on ignoring someone's reality is not unity," he replied calmly. The elder did not respond further, instead lowering his gaze and stepping back into silence. Olivia listened to the exchange without speaking, her thoughts moving more slowly than before, as though she was still adjusting to the idea that her experience was no longer being dismissed by default. For so long, she had expected her words to be measured against suspicion before they were even fully heard. Now, the pattern had shifted, and it left her uncertain how to interpret the space she was standing in. Ethan returned his attention to her. "You have spent long enough adapting to being unheard," he said. Olivia hesitated before answering, her voice quiet but steady. "I did not realize I was allowed to expect anything different," she admitted. The honesty in her words carried no defense, only realization. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging without correction. "Expectations are often shaped by what people repeatedly experience," he said. "That does not make them accurate reflections of what should be." The surrounding pack remained silent, though the nature of that silence had changed again. It was no longer passive or dismissive. It was attentive in a restrained, uncertain way, as though many were now listening not only to Olivia, but also to their own internal reconsiderations. Olivia shifted her stance slightly, but this time the movement was less guarded. The effort to conceal every trace of discomfort had begun to loosen, replaced by a careful awareness that she was not being evaluated solely through judgment anymore. Ethan observed this without comment, allowing the moment to remain uninterrupted. After a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice measured but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "When someone speaks about their experience, the responsibility of those listening is not to decide quickly," he said. "It is to ensure that nothing important is dismissed before it is understood." A subtle ripple moved through the crowd. Some lowered their eyes, others exchanged quiet glances, and a few remained completely still, absorbing the implication of what had been said. Olivia looked down briefly, then slowly raised her gaze again. "I always thought I had to justify everything I felt in order for it to matter," she said quietly. Ethan responded without hesitation. "You were never required to justify existence in order to be acknowledged," he said. The words settled deeply, not as comfort alone, but as correction to a belief she had carried for longer than she had realized. Olivia stood in silence, no longer adjusting herself out of habit or expectation. For the first time that morning, she was not measuring her presence against the reactions of others. Instead, she was beginning to understand that being heard did not require her to shrink in order to fit into someone else's interpretation of acceptable truth. The silence across Ash Hollow Pack had settled into a new form, no longer defined by uncertainty alone, but by a shared awareness that something fundamental in their understanding of one another had begun to shift. Olivia Harper remained standing where she had been for most of the morning, yet her posture had softened in ways she did not consciously recognize. The constant effort to conceal every trace of discomfort was still present, but it no longer felt like the only way she was allowed to exist within the gathering. Ethan Blackwood stood beside her, composed and steady, his attention no longer focused on uncovering the truth, but on ensuring that what had already been acknowledged would not be ignored or reinterpreted into silence again. Around them, members of the pack remained in place, their reactions subdued and uneven. Some avoided direct eye contact. Others watched quietly with expressions that suggested reflection rather than judgment, and a few simply stood still as though unsure whether they were meant to speak or remain silent. A council elder finally broke the stillness, his voice measured but noticeably less confident than before. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "we understand your concern, but the ceremony was established to maintain unity. Prolonging discussion of individual matters may create unnecessary division." Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression unchanged, yet carrying a firmness that did not require escalation. "Unity is not preserved by ignoring what has already been revealed," he replied evenly. The elder hesitated, then stepped back without further argument, his silence signaling reluctant acceptance rather than disagreement. Olivia listened without interrupting, her attention divided between the exchange unfolding around her and the internal realization that she was no longer being dismissed by default. That change was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. For a long time, she had learned to anticipate disbelief before she even spoke. Now, that expectation no longer held the same certainty. Ethan redirected his attention to her. "You have adapted to being unheard for longer than you should have needed to," he said calmly. Olivia paused before responding, her voice quiet but no longer as guarded. "I did not know there was another way to exist within a group," she admitted. The honesty in her words carried no attempt to defend or justify, only recognition of what her experience had shaped over time. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging without correction. "What people become used to is often mistaken for what is normal," he said. "But repetition does not define truth." The surrounding pack remained silent, though the nature of that silence had shifted again. It was no longer rooted in dismissal or discomfort alone. It had become reflective, as though many were now considering not only what had been said, but what had previously gone unspoken. Olivia shifted her stance slightly, but this time the movement was not driven by urgency to conceal discomfort. It was a quieter adjustment, one that suggested she was beginning to understand she did not need to constantly minimize herself in order to remain present. Ethan observed this without comment, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. After a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice steady and clear enough to carry without force. "When someone shares their experience," he said, "the responsibility of those listening is not to reach conclusions quickly. It is to ensure that nothing meaningful is dismissed before it is fully understood." A subtle ripple moved through the crowd. Some lowered their gaze. Others exchanged brief, uncertain glances, and a few remained still, absorbing the implication of what had just been stated. Olivia looked down for a moment, then slowly raised her gaze again. "I always believed I had to explain everything perfectly for it to matter," she said softly. Ethan responded without hesitation. "You were never required to perfect your explanation in order to deserve acknowledgement," he said. The words settled deeply, not as comfort alone, but as a quiet correction to a belief she had carried for far longer than she had realized. Olivia stood in silence, no longer adjusting herself out of habit or expectation. For the first time that morning, she was not measuring her presence against the reactions of others. Instead, she was beginning to understand that being heard did not depend on reducing herself to something easier for others to accept. The atmosphere over Ash Hollow Pack had grown quieter in a way that no longer felt accidental, as though the entire ceremonial gathering had collectively entered a state of reflection rather than performance. Olivia Harper remained in her place, though the tension that had defined her posture earlier in the morning had softened into something less rigid. She was still aware of her discomfort, still conscious of every small adjustment her body made, but the urgency to conceal it had begun to fade under the weight of being taken seriously without resistance. Ethan Blackwood stood beside her, unchanged in presence but different in focus, no longer evaluating her words for validity, but ensuring that the space around her did not revert to dismissal. Around them, the pack remained still in uneven clusters of silence. Some avoided looking directly at Olivia. Others observed with expressions that suggested reconsideration rather than judgment, and a few simply stood with lowered gazes, as though replaying earlier moments in their minds. A council elder finally spoke again, his tone more cautious than before. "Your Majesty," he said, "we recognize your intent, but prolonged attention to a single individual during a ceremonial gathering risks shifting focus away from collective unity." Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression steady and composed. "Unity that depends on selective silence is not unity," he replied calmly. The elder did not respond further, stepping back into silence without resistance. Olivia listened to the exchange, her attention no longer divided between defending herself internally and enduring external interpretation. Something fundamental had changed in how she was experiencing the moment. She was no longer bracing for dismissal before she spoke. Ethan returned his focus to her. "You have spent a long time believing that minimizing yourself was necessary to remain included," he said. Olivia hesitated briefly before responding, her voice quiet but no longer uncertain. "It was the only way I knew how to avoid becoming a problem for others," she admitted. The sentence carried the weight of years lived under silent adaptation. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging without correction. "When someone adapts to constant dismissal," he said, "they eventually begin to believe silence is safety." The surrounding pack remained quiet, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer shaped by doubt or discomfort alone. It carried the faint weight of recognition, as though many were beginning to understand how easily assumptions had replaced observation. Olivia shifted slightly, but the movement was no longer controlled by fear of judgment. It was slower, more natural, as though she was no longer preparing herself for immediate misinterpretation. Ethan observed this without interruption, allowing the change to exist without forcing it into explanation. After a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice steady enough to carry without force. "What has been happening here is not about correcting a single misunderstanding," he said. "It is about recognizing how quickly certainty forms when listening is replaced by assumption." A subtle ripple moved through the crowd. Some lowered their gaze. Others exchanged quiet, uncertain glances, and a few remained still, absorbing the implication without response. Olivia looked down briefly, then slowly lifted her gaze again. "I always thought I had to explain myself perfectly for people to take me seriously," she said softly. Ethan responded without hesitation. "You were never meant to earn seriousness through perfection," he said. The words settled deeply, not as comfort alone, but as a quiet restructuring of a belief she had carried for far longer than she realized. Olivia stood in silence, no longer adjusting herself to fit expected reactions. For the first time since the ceremony began, she was not measuring her existence against interpretation. Instead, she was beginning to understand that being heard did not require shrinking, apologizing, or proving she deserved space within it. The ceremonial grounds of Ash Hollow Pack remained suspended in a rare kind of stillness, where even the smallest movement felt deliberate and every glance carried new awareness rather than assumption. Olivia Harper stood quietly in the same place she had occupied for much of the morning, though her awareness of that space had changed in ways she could not fully articulate. The need to constantly prepare for dismissal had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer defined every breath she took. Ethan Blackwood remained beside her, composed and steady, his attention no longer directed at proving or disproving anything, but at ensuring that what had already been understood would not be reduced again into misunderstanding. Around them, the pack stood in layered silence. Some members avoided direct eye contact, others watched with subdued expressions, and a few simply stood still as though uncertain whether they were meant to continue observing or begin reflecting. The earlier confidence of collective judgment had fully dissolved, replaced by something quieter and more fragile, shaped by reconsideration rather than certainty. A council elder finally spoke, his voice noticeably less firm than before. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "while we understand the importance of listening, the ceremony is still in progress. The pack has gathered for unity and tradition." Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression unchanged but carrying steady resolve. Unity that depends on ignoring truth is not unity, he replied evenly. The elder did not continue, instead lowering his gaze and stepping back into silence without resistance. Olivia listened without interruption, no longer bracing herself for dismissal with every sentence spoken around her. Something fundamental had shifted in how she experienced being present among others. She was no longer anticipating rejection before she even spoke. Ethan returned his focus to her. You have lived long enough under the assumption that your experience needed approval before it could be acknowledged, he said calmly. Olivia hesitated before answering, her voice quieter than before but no longer unstable. I thought if I made myself easier to ignore, I would avoid becoming a burden, she admitted. The sentence carried the weight of repetition across years, each moment of silence reinforcing the belief that visibility required justification. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging without correction. What you describe is not avoidance, he said. It is adaptation to environments that failed to listen properly. The surrounding pack remained silent, but the silence had shifted again. It was no longer rooted in doubt or judgment alone. It carried recognition, as though many were beginning to understand how easily collective certainty had formed without sufficient observation. Olivia shifted slightly, but the movement was no longer defensive. It was slower, more natural, as though her body was no longer preparing for immediate invalidation. Ethan observed this without comment, allowing the moment to continue without interruption. After a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice steady and clear. When people are not listened to consistently, he said, they begin to believe their voice must be minimized to remain acceptable. That belief is not truth. It is consequence. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Some lowered their gaze. Others exchanged brief, uncertain looks, and a few remained still, absorbing the weight of what had been said. Olivia looked down briefly, then slowly raised her eyes again. I always thought I needed to explain myself perfectly to be taken seriously, she said softly. Ethan responded without hesitation. You were never required to earn acknowledgement through perfection, he said. The words settled deeply, not as reassurance alone, but as correction to a long-held misunderstanding that had shaped how she moved through the world. Olivia stood in silence, no longer adjusting herself to fit expected interpretations. For the first time since the ceremony began, she was not measuring her existence against external judgment. Instead, she was beginning to understand that being heard was not something she had to qualify for, but something she had always deserved. The ceremonial grounds of Ash Hollow Pack had not changed in appearance, yet everything about the atmosphere felt fundamentally different from when the morning had begun. The same stone pathways, the same arranged benches, and the same seasonal banners still stood beneath the pale light of the sky, but the meaning carried through the space had shifted in ways that could not be reversed by tradition alone. Olivia Harper remained standing where she had been for much of the gathering, though her stillness no longer carried the same tension it once did. The constant anticipation of dismissal had softened into something quieter, replaced by a cautious awareness that her experience no longer needed to be defended at every moment. Ethan Blackwood stood beside her, composed and unwavering, his presence no longer functioning as interruption, but as acknowledgement that extended beyond the immediate exchange. Around them, the pack remained in collective silence, though it was no longer the silence of confusion or resistance. It had become reflective, uneven, and uncertain, as though each individual was processing not only what had been said, but what had been assumed without evidence. A council elder finally stepped forward, his voice measured and noticeably subdued. Your Majesty, he said, if the intention is to bring clarity, then perhaps this moment should be concluded with proper guidance so the pack can understand how to proceed. Ethan turned slightly toward him, his expression unchanged but carrying finality. Understanding does not come from ending a conversation prematurely, he said calmly. The elder hesitated, then lowered his gaze, stepping back without further objection. Olivia listened without interruption, her awareness no longer divided between self-protection and external judgment. Something essential had changed in the way she occupied space among others. She was no longer bracing for disbelief as an automatic response. Ethan returned his focus to her, his tone steady and without urgency. You have spent a long time believing your voice required validation before it could be considered real, he said. Olivia hesitated briefly before responding, her voice quiet but no longer fragile. I thought if I minimized myself enough, I would not disrupt anything important, she admitted. The statement reflected not a single moment, but a pattern of adaptation shaped by repeated experience. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the weight of that understanding without attempting to soften it unnecessarily. What you describe is not insignificance, he said. It is a learned response to environments that did not make space for listening. The surrounding pack remained still, but the silence had changed once again. It no longer carried dismissal or uncertainty alone. It carried recognition, as though many were beginning to see how easily certainty had been formed without sufficient awareness. Olivia shifted slightly, but the movement no longer carried the same guarded restraint. It was slower, more natural, as though her body was no longer preparing for immediate rejection. Ethan observed this without commentary, allowing the moment to remain uninterrupted. After a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice calm but firm enough to reach those nearby. When people are not consistently heard, he said, they begin to believe silence is safer than expression. That belief is not truth. It is consequence. A subtle ripple moved through the crowd. Some lowered their gaze. Others exchanged quiet, uncertain glances, and a few remained completely still, absorbing the implication of what had been acknowledged. Olivia looked down for a moment, then slowly raised her eyes again. I always thought I needed to be flawless in explaining myself for anyone to take me seriously, she said softly. Ethan responded without hesitation. You were never required to perfect your explanation in order to deserve recognition, he said. The words settled deeply, not as reassurance alone, but as correction to a belief that had shaped her understanding of presence and worth for far longer than she had realized. Olivia stood in silence, no longer adjusting herself to accommodate expectation. For the first time since the ceremony had begun, she was not measuring her existence against external interpretation. Instead, she was beginning to understand that being heard was not something she needed to earn through reduction of self, but something that should have existed for her all along.